For instance, New Testament theology allowed doctrines like the Trinity to remain largely unexplained. New Testament writers did not address the details of the relationships between the persons of the Trinity. But in the Patristic period, theologians used logical analysis to explain what New Testament writers believed about the Trinity, even though the biblical writers had not stated their views explicitly. In response to false teachings about God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, early church fathers devoted themselves to careful distinctions through rational reflection, working out as many details left untouched in the New Testament as they possibly could. In this way, applying reason to theology became an important value for theologians as they ministered in their Neoplatonic world. In the third place, Patristic theology also focused on mysticism, or transcendent spiritual enlightenment, in response to Neoplatonism's emphasis on mysticism. As we have seen, in Neoplatonism, careful reasoning through attention to the human mind was merely a stepping stone to higher, mystical levels of union with God. Reason was limited and could not grasp higher spiritual realities, and reaching these higher levels required special illumination. In a similar way, when early Christian fathers expounded doctrines such as the Trinity, or the divinity and humanity of Christ, or the sacraments and the Church, they often confessed that some elements of these doctrines were beyond human reason. Frequently, their rational discussions were coupled with acknowledgments that the higher truths of the Christian faith simply could not be explained or defended rationally. Instead, they could only be apprehended through mystical enlightenment, through supernatural experiences that exceeded the reaches of human rationality. Patristic theology employed reason in service to God's revelation, but it leaned more heavily on spiritual intuition than on logical proof. So it is that as theologians of the patristic period faced the challenges of teaching, exploring, and defending Christian theology in their Gentile world, their strategies and emphases shifted. These shifts toward the priority of the spiritual over the physical, or theology from above, the use of rational analysis, and reliance on mysticism set a course for the Church that would eventually lead to what we know today as systematic theology. Now that we have seen how theologians began to explain Christian theology to their Hellenistic culture during the patristic period, we should turn to medieval theology, when Christians more consistently applied Hellenistic views of human rationality and logic to Christian theology. We'll be concerned with a theological movement, often called scholasticism, that developed roughly from AD 600 to AD 1500. Our exploration of scholasticism will resemble the way we looked at patristic theology. On the one hand, we'll look at the cultural changes that gave rise to scholasticism, and on the other hand, we'll explore some of the theological changes that resulted. Let's think first about the cultural shifts that took place during these centuries. To begin with, we should point out that the term scholasticism derives from schools of higher learning in early medieval Europe. In those schools, lecturers in dialectic, normally called logic in the modern age, were known by the Latin term scholasticus. Largely, these lecturers taught Aristotle's logic. Consequently, the term scholastic came to be applied to philosophy and theology that depended heavily on the principles of logic in Aristotle's philosophy. Scholasticism resulted from one of the most important cultural shifts that took place in the medieval period. This shift occurred when the intellectual communities of the Mediterranean world turned away from Neoplatonism and toward the philosophy of Aristotle. And as a result of this shift, leading Christians had to adapt the ways they explained and defended Christian doctrines to Aristotelian philosophy. Of course, this shift towards scholasticism took place over hundreds of years, and there was much resistance to it, especially from Christian mystics. But by the time of Albertus Magnus or Albert the Great, who lived from around 1206 to 1280, and his well-known disciple Thomas Aquinas, who lived from around 1225 to 1274, scholasticism represented the dominant form of Christian theology. Just before the Reformation, the mainstream of Christian theology was deeply attuned to the philosophical viewpoints of Aristotle. Now that we have looked at some of the cultural changes that gave rise to scholasticism, we should turn to some of its basic characteristics. What marked scholasticism as a major approach to Christian theology?